Is Dr. Jess Watson. I'm the Executive Director of Earth Day 365, and we are extremely pleased today to have Marianne Lazarus with us as our keynote speaker for Earth Month. Hopefully you've been participating in some of the other activities that we've been doing, and maybe you've gotten your Earth Day celebration kit from one of the many distribution points and have been doing some fun upcycle crafts or doing the treasure hunt in Forest Park, the treasure hunt from Forest Relief. But so today is our keynote, and we also have a really fun dance performance afterwards. It's a premiere of a dance called Human Disturbance on the topic of climate change. So stick around after the keynote, and you'll be rewarded. So Marianne, thank you so much for being here today. Let me tell you a little bit about our wonderful guest. Marianne Lazarus is a consultant with the architectural firm Cameron McAllister Group, where she works with design firms to integrate greater sustainability and resiliency outcomes throughout their practice. Marianne is an adjunct faculty and sustainability program coordinator at Washington University in St. Louis. She is the founder of the Sustainable Design Initiative at HOK, a global design firm whose pioneering green leadership has helped propel sustainability from a fringe activity to a significant mainstream movement, shaping the future of architecture. She serves on the USGB local board and is an author, lecturer, community advocate, and volunteer. So basically, if you couldn't tell from my intro, she's a rock star in the field of sustainable design and resilience. Which is why we turned to her when we were thinking about resilience as our theme this year for Earth Day. So I'm so excited that you could join us here today, Marianne. Thank you again, and I will turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Jess. And thank you to all my buddies out there who are here to watch this show with me. And I'm really hoping we can have a meaningful dialogue as a result of today's meeting. So hang on, am I sharing yet? Share.
Yeah, there you go.
Share, there, now I'm sharing. So let's talk about resilience and the power of community. And this is a really, really important topic, and one I think is just so relevant to St. Louis today. And I'll get into that in a minute, but I think we got to start with sort of what is resilience, because it's a word that, like sustainability, has just taken on so many different meanings. And it's important to have that kind of fundamental basis, at least for today's conversation about resilience and what it means. And starting with the kind of environmental resilience, the origin of the word really was in the 70s, when the colleges of the world were talking about resilience and the resilience of systems to absorb change and disturbance and maintain their functionality. So it's, natural systems are really about maintaining function. That's their goal in life, is to stay alive and thrive. So this example in the image here of a algae pond, where if enough eutrophication happens, then you reach a tipping point, and then you're no longer able to return to that state of functionality. So in all essence, in resilience, certainly in the ecological systems, and I think it absolutely refers to us too, in the human systems, is to maintain function and not reach those tipping points where we cannot go back to a livable condition. So that's sort of the ecological analysis of resilience. And it's really about understanding that Earth is always in a dynamic state of equilibrium. There's no steady state on Earth. Everything's always changing, and certainly we've seen that lately. And systems have to learn to respond to that, have to be able to be flexible and adaptable. So look at these two bowls. On the left is, a sphere in a bowl that can adjust at any point to whatever movement there is, whereas the one on the right is a shape that does not accommodate change and will tip over. So ideally, we want to have that left state, that I understand that dynamic state, and always be able to shift even when we don't know which way things are going to go. So our solutions have to be dynamic and adaptive. Another definition of resilience coming from the built environment world is the ability to prepare and plan, absorb and recover, and more successfully adapt to events when they occur. So it's really about not just recovering, but adapting. And that's really my preferred way of understanding resilience. So what are adverse events? You know, these shocks are, this is a term that really became very popular about, I don't know, 5 years ago with the 100 Resilient Cities initiative, you know, looking at those kind of dynamic, short-term, but very impactful events. This, you know, is what people think about when they think about resilience. They think about, oh, it's tornadoes and hurricanes and floods and sometimes human-caused events like terrorism, civil unrest. So these are, you know, short-term, and then we can go back to wherever we were. And one thing that's interesting, when I was putting this together, I realized, okay, this is a slide I've used for years, but not in the context that we've been living through. I mean, there is the biggest shock event of my lifetime, I think all of our lifetimes, has been the pandemic. We've had to completely change our behaviors. I mean, 180 degrees, with rare exception. Our life is completely turned upside down. We're getting used to it and things are looking a little better, but you know, that's a shock, that not short-term shock. It's been, you know, over a year now. And in addition, we've had the civil unrest. You know, we've had a major, I mean, like civil rights movement of the 60s with the Black Lives Matter movement as a result of George Floyd's murder. I mean, just phenomenal uprising. Both these events happening in the last 12 months. So we've had some pretty major shocks. And so when we look at this shock slide again, it's like, whoa, that's a lot to be taken in. But when we think about the contributors to resilience, it's not just shocks, it's also what, you know, the term stressors has been used. So stressors are system-wide conditions that contribute to our ability to respond and recover when those, you know, major shocks happen. So these are underlying conditions, they're constant, they're slower moving. I mean, things like systemic racism is a stressor that contributes to resilience or lack thereof. Environmental degradation, population growth, aging population, all these things that we're very familiar with in our region. Aging infrastructure is a big problem. Food scarcity is a big problem. You know, all of this, we don't get sea level rise, so that's kind of good news. But in many respects, we are very much subject to these kinds of stressors. So in a, you know, ideal resilience world, what we're trying to do is have those stressors, that little purple jagged line, be actually improving over time so that when those shocks happen, we're able to, you know, have less of an impact. Our adaptive capacity, another term in the resilience world, our adaptive capacity is actually improving so that we're able to deal with those shocks and continue to move on and actually improve quality of life. So that's sort of the idealized, you know, resilience model when I'm talking about resilience. So it's all these factors. So we're really looking at bouncing forward, not just bouncing back. So that common ground of resilience, and one of the other things that we've really seen, and you know, it's a lesson that there's so many examples of now, is that risk, your risk factor in terms of how much impact there's going to be, is a combination of those stressors and shocks. It's a hazard. Is there a hazard? You know, if there's no, you know, we're not sea level rise, so there's no sea level hazard in St. Louis, but there always are hazards of every variety everywhere. But the vulnerability is that stress-related variable. So the higher your vulnerabilities and the higher potential of hazard, the greater the risk. So this little not very friendly diagram, here's somebody who's got, you know, low vulnerability, something happens, and their ability to recover is potentially even catastrophic. They can't do it at all. I mean, an example that we're familiar with is someone who's low income, depends on their car to get to work, and their car breaks down and they don't have any money and therefore can't work anymore. I mean, that's reality for many people. Whereas those who have a high degree of capacity, a shock happens, they're in much better position. So this hazard, vulnerability, risk relationship is something, again, that has just been glaring in the past year, but has been, very much known for many, many, many years. So here's a quote from the St. Louis Resilience Report, the St. Louis City Resilience Report. This was done as a part of their resiliency effort through the 100 resilient cities. And it really sort of puts it down to inequity. Inequity is really the core of the stressors across our region and is fundamental to how resilient we can be. So addressing inequities is really, if you read the report, a lot of it is about overcoming inequities, which is so familiar to many reports coming out of St. Louis. So opportunities there we'll be talking about. In COVID again has just been a glaring example of this reality of vulnerability as a key factor. So here's the COVID death. Sorry to be depressing, but we'll get there, I promise. The COVID death demographic data for the city. So here's African-American population, Asian, Caucasian, the number of cases, the number of deaths. So you can see, the African-American population is especially proportionally much, much higher for the city. And these are things that have been, headline news. Same thing is true for the county. Again, a rate by 100,000. So we've seen, poster child of what vulnerability means in terms of resilience in our very own community. The question of climate is really front and center in something I've really been focusing on. My particular area of interest and research and application in the past decade, actually longer, has been about the effect of climate on resilience. And there's no question that really climate is a force multiplier. So those kinds of vulnerabilities only get, worse based on climate. And we've heard this, if you were listening at all yesterday to the climate summit, Biden's climate summit, which I just had a few minutes to listen to, but it's so exciting what's going on. That was the key message there. It has across the board. It has, climate's is exacerbating, will exacerbate our existing conditions, from security issues to food access to, livability, migration. All this stuff is being impacted and will continue to contribute to the effect of vulnerability across the globe. One example in our own country is, I love this map. It comes out every year. I don't know, I must have a morbid kind of personality, but whatever it is, this is the $1 billion weather and climate disaster map. So it comes out every year from NOAA. So each one of these little bubbles is a $1 billion event. In 2020, there were 22 $1 billion events. And you recognize them. Look at all these wildfires out in the West. And, we had a record number of hurricanes last year that we had to go into the Greek alphabet to start naming: tornadoes, extreme weather, storms, ice, even drought, which continues to be a major issue. And these were all shock events. So these are, they didn't last forever, though some of those wildfires felt like they did. And interestingly, there's a lot of attribution science in the past decade that have made very clear that these kinds of storm events are partly attributable to climate. That is to say, they wouldn't necessarily not happen without climate change, but the climate change makes them more extreme, more severe, more frequent. And, as we look to the future, even in the best of all worlds, these will continue to grow in number. And 2020 being a good example of that. So 2020 set the annual record of 22 events, which the previous record was 16. So I don't think that's a record we necessarily want to continue to break. But the last record was in 2017, and 2020 is the 6th year in a row where we've had over $10 billion weather and climate disasters. So this is becoming a norm and, continues to be a big problem in our region. Heavy rainfalls are projected to increase over the next 2 decades only. And these are not, steady state rain. This is like a severe rain followed by, sometimes drought. So it's those flood events. It's those ones that our, combined storm sewer systems really aren't set up for. And I think, even more scary is the projected heat increase. So up to 40 days over 100 years, over 100 degrees by the end of the century. That's really scary. I mean, extreme heat is a killer. And, you know, we're currently at a historical average of 3 days a year, though it felt like more than that recently, up to 40. So, you know, we've got some serious impacts that we need to grapple with. And in our region, you know, again, the people in the lower income neighborhoods are the ones who are going to be most affected, are being affected, and will continue to be more affected as these changes happen. You know, so urban heat island is a really useful image. You know, the higher shading, the higher number of pervious surfaces, you know, the impact on urban heat island is lower, and opposite happens. You know, there can be a 10-degree difference easily in parts of our region based on the number of shade trees and other impervious surfaces. The asthma and allergies, you know, will go up with climate. You know, there's a study done by WashU that shows that local children, Black children, are 10 times more likely to suffer from asthma. Flooding is a big problem, and particularly in low-lying areas, and some of those are in extreme poverty, and that also leads to potential insect-borne diseases. And though I did see Gene Ponzi last week talk about how we've got to stop thinking all mosquitoes are bad, because some are not bad. So I want to shout out to Gene. I heard you, but some are, and create, you know, unhealthy conditions. So, you know, we really got to think about climate when we think about vulnerability as well. This is a image from the St. Louis Resilience Report looking at the social vulnerability to climate change by census tract. So I think we're getting pretty tired of seeing this image of the city and sort of where the most vulnerable areas are. But this is, again, thinking about social vulnerability, which really is about community-based vulnerability. So, you know, just reminding ourselves that the climate vulnerabilities for low incomes are so much greater for those in the middle and upper income, and you know, community is, we'll get to that in a minute, is such an important variable there. So housing is more vulnerable. Your wages, if there's effects from extreme weather on your ability to work, that creates a real hole in the safety net, and then there's greater health risks. So enough about what we mean by resilience and how much it's dependent on sort of the state of vulnerability, to talk about how do we actually address this and think about it at the community scale, the theme of my talk today. But when we, you know, resilience can happen at all scales. I mean, there's ecosystem resilience, and I think that's really interesting way to be looking at that issue. There's the city scale, neighborhoods, something we love in our city, community, you know, small community, even buildings. That's where my focus has been more at the building, sort of the building and near neighborhood scale, and the personal scale. And, you know, I think we've each been subject to challenges in the past year through COVID that have tested our own personal resilience and ways to grow our ability to adapt and deal with adversity and unknown conditions. So I think it's a very familiar state now for everyone because of COVID, but we really want to talk about community scale. That's today's theme, and it's such an important aspect of resilience. So I want to tell a story. This story will be familiar to Jen because she took my class on resilience. So I could turn it over to her and she could tell the story, but I won't. So this is a story about two neighborhoods in Chicago in the mid-90s. And for those who were around then, you may remember that it was a big heat wave. There was a heat wave as well in St. Louis a little later in the 90s, where there was this, you know, in July of 1995, 730 people died in Chicago from heat-related impacts. So that's, you know, just a phenomenal number of people. And nobody anticipated anything close to that would happen. And there's lots of studies into what happened and why it happened. And one of them really is a great way of explaining the role of community. So there were many neighborhoods were analyzed, but several show this kind of interesting lessened by sociologists and others. So this is a tale of two neighborhoods, starting in North Lawndale, which you can see on the map is this tiny little sort of west of Lake Michigan. A poor neighborhood. 71% of the people in the neighborhood live below poverty level. A lot of older population, 8.5% were over 65, and a quarter of those lived alone, and a minority population, almost completely Black population. 19 people died in this small neighborhood from heat-related deaths that July, which is a rate of 40 out of 100,000. So that's North Lawndale, poor neighborhood, lots of unfortunate demises. Here's South Lawndale. South Lawndale sits just south of North Lawndale, no surprise, similar kind of numbers. So when we go back to those vulnerabilities, you think, okay, these guys are in a similar position in terms of their kind of demographics. Again, 62% of the people lived 2 times below the poverty level, more seniors percentage-wise, and more seniors living alone than in North Lawndale. Again, a majority minority, but in this case, Latinx. And only 3 people died. So that's a pretty big difference. Similar size, similar demographics. Why only 3 people in this community and 14 in the other community? So here's what North Lawndale looked like. Not great pictures, but you get a sense. This is somewhat familiar for those who are familiar with parts of our city. And bombed out areas, no real sense of community, high violence, high crime, little bits of church activity, but not a whole lot. And here's South Lawndale. South Lawndale was a heavily Mexican immigrant area, but a strong, vibrant commercial district. People hung out on the streets. They knew each other. A strong church and other civic organizations. So when those older people living alone didn't show up at church, somebody went, whoa, I better go check and see what happened. And they would, make sure they were okay. And they would bring them to their homes, or they didn't actually have cooling centers yet. This was sort of why cooling centers happened. So there's a real lesson from this, and it's been repeated over and over again, that the power of community is what can save people's lives in terms of those shock events and really reduce those stressors so that people are able to overcome shocks. So that's what made all the difference, is what they call the social environment of poverty. So even though these are both poor areas, this had strong social capital, and North Lawndale did not. So social capital is really the kind of one of the key terms when we think about resilience. How do you foster social capital? How do you build these networks? How do you create this sense of trust and safety so people will come outside and help each other? So I want to talk about that. But first, another map. This is the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index for our region. Again, the darker color is our higher vulnerability. And, I think, I don't know about you, but I'm kind of tired of seeing all these same areas, and it's like time to really think about that and how can we overcome it. I think there's a lot of opportunity now to address these issues. The CDC social vulnerability is really based on 4 themes: socioeconomic status, household composition, and whether there's disability, race, ethnicity, and housing typology. So these 4 factors are what go into the social vulnerability. So write your questions down, because we may have to talk about some of this stuff. So let's talk about how do we actually enhance community resilience. The power of community clearly is important, but what do you do about it? So there's sort of, again, through the sociologists and others who've analyzed this, a set of strategies to really build and grow social capital. The first one is called bonding social capital. And this is sort of those levels of trust that are closest. These are your tightest bonds that usually are shared among peers, among family members, under your, the closest people in your world, and not necessarily people who live closer. I think we've learned that. So these are the people you go on a picnic with. These are the ones that remember picnics, and maybe that will happen again. Where these are your go-to people. And it's interesting to me that under COVID, we found such a strong need to have these bonds, maintain these bonds. And at least in the case of me and my husband, these weren't necessarily people that we had seen frequently. These weren't necessarily part of our regular life, but in a COVID, in an extreme condition that we were forced into, they became so important. So not just family members, but close friends from decades ago, we would connect with, and not just once, but repeatedly have happy hours and coffee, because we had this common bond. And I think it's really I think we've had a chance to rethink what this bonding social capital is really about. But it also, and I'll get on this later, I think it really challenges us to think harder about who we want those bonds to be with. This is a quote from the former FEMA administrator during Katrina, though this image is not, which really reinforces that your neighbor is your first responder. You're not counting on the authorities to show up and save you. You're counting on each other. Our neighbors are our greatest resource. This picture is from one of the Houston floods recently, where neighbors helped rescue each other. There's just not that many resources out there that we can just rely on from some authority. So we really need to depend on each other. In St. Louis, the bonding tends to be, as I've observed, very, where'd you go to high school kind of stuff, based on identity. And that can be a negative too. It's really looking at inherent structural racism that is established in terms of race, religion, education, income. And so when we think about bonding and bonding social capital, it's important to think about how to not fall back into sort of a comfort zone. Bridging is another kind of important social capital. These are weaker ties, but are important to bring groups and organizations together in alliances and create coalitions towards common goals and build those kinds of strength in numbers. And I think an unbelievable example of that has been, again, the recent civil unrest. I mean, people came together and are still coming together who never had anything to do with each other. And pop-ups of community activism in, Wildwood and, places that, you don't think of when you think about people protesting, but the clarity of the challenge before us in addressing these issues has raised, the human outcry really globally, and has created these opportunities for bridges that we didn't see exist before. And, even in the last 30, 40 years. So I think it's really a great opportunity to think about bridging in a new way through these connections, if we can continue to build on those. Some other wonderful bridging opportunities that happened through COVID, and this is from Jen at Known and Grown, is the ability to kind of, in the past, when I would buy stuff from my CSA or the farmer's market, there was no real connection to the people that actually grew my food, except maybe the vendor. I might get to know a little bit, but Known and Grown put together this local food locator to allow the consumer at the individual level, closeted in their house, to directly connect with the producer and get a relationship going, really begin to know each other in a new way, begin to get their newsletters and learn about what was coming down the pike next week and how to grow it. I mean, there's just a wonderful new kind of relationship that was built, this bridging relationship through food, as well as all the benefits of local food. And speaking of food, here's another example of a wonderful community-based effort by the Hiro Urban Farm and Garden, where Tyrene Lewis, who was the founder of this, realized he was in a food apartheid desert and neighborhood and wanted to address it. So really focused on creating healthy, organic food and building community through that. So, you know, it's really, as he says, a whole ecosystem he's created of people and plants and bugs, everything all coming together in a new, very healthy way. You know, the Earth Day does this. Just a couple of days ago, they held an event with Red Circle at North County Agricultural Education Center to do potato beds. My husband contributed to that. If I understand, it was a pretty miserable, wet day, but a lot of people turned out. And that's a bridging event. You know, if those kinds of relationships can grow, then we have stronger community. Our religious organizations play such an enormous role in that kind of way to bring people together, not just among their own communities, but across communities, across religious communities. A lot of collaboration happens, and, you know, a really ripe area for fostering social capital. Now, the sort of last category of social capital is linking. So we had bonding. There's going to be a test afterwards, bridging and linking. And linking is really looking at where you can bring resources at a higher level. So think of vertical links, where there's resources, there's money, there's ideas, there's information, then can be shared back to the community in order to help them be, you know, basically address those stressors effectively and bring much greater ability to be strong and more resilient. So in our community, we have some pretty exciting, you know, people that have really created this linkage world. You know, Wesley Bell, the new prosecuting attorney for St. Louis County, my new state representative, House Representative Cori Bush, doing incredible things. You know, this is sort of a poster child linking, where we have, you know, people who will listen and respond to need at the community level. Something not to be discounted at all. Other linkages is, you know, the Food Network. Again, COVID it's always existed, but just went on into high gear during COVID with all these community efforts to bring resources directly to people, particularly people who are most in need, of course. And, you know, just story after story. I like this story that Emily Andrews shared with me about St. Louis Mutual Aid, because this is really kind of a everything in the whole wide world social capital story. They, you know, began by sharing food. If I got it straight, $800,000 in contributions to really create a network of neighbor-to-neighbor network of food distribution. But then it grew. It grew because they realized there was more opportunity and there was more interest and more need. And they were joined by others who gave them money. So area funders, you know, serious money. St. Louis Community Foundation, Deaconess Foundation saw them as an important part of the community growing and has given them money. So now they have a system in place. They've formed a community care council. So they've made a long-term commitment to the community and how to help grow community. So from something that was much more sort of food, it has grown into this long-term linkage opportunity. I want to tell a little story, a little case study about a project in New Orleans, grew out of Katrina. And this map shows the city of New Orleans after the flood, when a bunch of planners came into the city and said, here's what you need to do. All these areas that are lower ninth, we're familiar with, all these areas that in the low-lying areas that were heavily flooded as a result of not Katrina, but because of bad planning and civil engineering, but that's a different story. All these homes should be raised and should just become a floodplain because they're never going to recover. And what they didn't know, these planners, or weren't sensitive to fact, is these were very strong and vibrant communities. And yes, there was severe devastation, but these were, and New Orleans at that point, and not quite as much now, was predominantly generations of people who lived in the city. It was, not the opposite of Portland and places that have, influx. It was really people who lived for generations. Those houses were their only equity. They might have been devastated, but that was home. And having someone come in from the outside and say, we need to take your houses down. You can see what this gentleman had to say. I don't know you, but I hate you. There was such an outpouring of public kind of sentiment against this kind of behavior. So, shortly after that, when, everything had dried up, this beautiful old building was donated to the community in one of those green dot communities. And they were also provided funding. I'm not sure whether it was where the source of that funding was, but enough funding to not only renovate that building, but also add a library. So the library became, and it still is very much, a community center. So a place that, students could meet, after school events, adult ed, a real fostering community kind of place. But one of the things I love about this story is they also put a cafe in that beautiful old building, and sort of thumbing their nose at the urban planners. They call it the Green Dot Cafe. So another kind of wonderful expression of community building. So you may have noticed that I'm talking about food a lot in my resilience talk, and it's true, but not just because I like food and because it's really important to our health and our local economy to be thinking about growing our own and addressing the food apartheid, but also because of the really important relationship between people and resilience and planet and resilience. There's really no difference when we talk about resilience between planetary and people. We are all part of that. And I love this quote from Jeffrey Bonner, who just announced his retirement, that really speaks to that. That human health and wellness is a function of health and wellness of planet Earth. We really can't discriminate between those two. So when we think about what we can do for resilience around climate, it also has benefits for all of us. So, one of the advantages of really thinking about food and creating healthy food systems is also that has a benefit for climate around soil remediation and sequestration. Clearly, the more plant life we have, the less hard surfaces, we have cleaner air, cleaner health benefits. The relationship between shade and lower temperatures is really important. And I think fundamentally it's about biodiversity. And the more we can benefit biodiversity, the more that benefits all of us. And one of the exciting things about St. Louis is our commitment to city scale biodiversity. And this connection between planetary health and human health has just been in fact, there was an article yesterday I meant to bring in here from the Washington Post that speaks to this as well. But UN in February put out a new blueprint they call Making Peace with Nature. And it's really talking about the linkages between environmental and development challenges and the roles of that kind of interrelationship around the UN Sustainable Development Goals and planetary health. And it's just, I think, more and more important every day to recognize this when we talk about resilience. So let's talk about what we can do about this. So I've talked about what it means and a little bit about what the key ingredients of community social resilience are, but what can we do? A few words of advice from Marianne. We really want to bounce forward, not bounce back. And we want to think about those bonds. What are the bonds we want to solidify? And again, I think that we've had a kind of opportunity with COVID to question that. Who are those bonds? How do we be more intentional about creating bonds, those really hard-wired kind of relationships beyond our comfort zone? We want to foster those community interactions as soon as we can, even virtually, but certainly social activities. And it's too bad we don't have Earth Day this year in the park, because that's such a great opportunity, but it'll be back. But there's no question that regular events that bring people together create higher levels of trust. And, let's bring people together in new ways. I was, really excited to see this effort that is underway and has been for a while through Parkway United Church of Christ, an interfaith initiative to bring people together from different faiths to learn about each other, and not just a one-off thing, but a long-term commitment to become familiar with each other and learn to respect each other. These are the kinds of things that can make a fundamental difference in that bridging. They have programs for children as well as adults. I'm not going to stop talking about community gardens because I think they're really an essential opportunity and has that, multiple benefits. I found this poster, oops, go back, of the, this is the community garden in my neighborhood in the Central West End that Marianne Lazarus did a poster because they've been busy for 10 years now doing a community garden that has a very key relationship with other communities within the region. So the food grown there is given away. It's not consumed by the people working at the garden in that situation. Let's talk a minute about resilience hubs. So resilience hubs are places that are community centers that offer opportunities for people to come together on a regular basis and build those kinds of strengths and relationships. But they also can, in times of shock, serve as shelters, as resources, as places to come power your phone, which is a big issue when the power goes out, or get fresh water, or even shelter in place, maybe have emergency communications. So resilience hubs are something that is starting to grow across the country. There's several underway in different cities. I think St. Louis would be well served by identifying some community-based resilience hubs as well. An example of a resilience hub, this is not in our region, but it's sort of a good case study of a project in Oregon. Now, Oregon is a earthquake hazard and a serious earthquake hazard zone. They've just recognized that in the last few years, much more than they realized. And so they've actually, in this one school district, they're requiring all new construction to also serve as resilience hubs. So in this particular thing, though, this is a new build, I think there's great lessons here for even existing conditions. This particular study, and this building is now built, they looked at 3 stages. They looked at sort of immediate, so 96 hours, what would happen in this community facility in the first 96 hours, in the first 30 days, and even beyond 30 days. So the first 96 hours, the school itself becomes a refuge for those people in situ. So assuming no one can leave at that point, but then it becomes a community shelter. And then if time goes on, even after 30 days, people may still need resources. The field itself becomes a long-term community space. In the design of the building was built around this, so that the auxiliary shelter, the classrooms actually were designed so they could serve as places of refuge if necessary, things like operable windows and emergency lighting. The main shelter areas, which would not necessarily be where people would spend the night, but they might have access to food, health-related, as well as lighting and water, are the cafeteria, gym, library, the kind of bigger spaces. There's actually an emergency communication center that the office space could take on. So pretty interesting way to think about buildings to be adaptive for different conditions. Back to that bowl with the ball in it. And lots of lessons to be learned from that. And I think those kinds of opportunities exist in our city and our region. Here's one of the schools that the city of St. Louis has said is going to be closed. I think still on the list. What amazing buildings these old Ittner schools are. And maybe that could be a community center and resilience hub, or existing community centers or existing libraries. All could take on these adaptive functions to accommodate this future state that we are going to be living in, if not already. Another thing we really need to do is overcome our physical barriers. And if we're going to do bridging, we got to figure out a way to do it in a way that that connects us rather than keeps us apart as our current world reality. So I think the work, maybe the North Side, South Side Metrolink, maybe the rapid buses, certainly the work of the Brick Line is really exciting because it's bringing people together. It's providing those kind of connectivity. I have really high hopes for the future of the PED and bike trail options as a way to really shatter some of those borders. And, wouldn't it be nice? Not the better together as it was originally described, but maybe someday, somehow. I know former Mayor Cruson just said this week that she didn't see this happening in her lifetime, but I'm going to try to be optimistic because it's Earth Week and all kinds of good things are happening. We think about linkages, think about where we have potential opportunities. I mean, here is Patrick Brown. Some of you may know Patrick was our Chief Resiliency Officer for the City of St. Louis, and now he is kind of part of the kitchen cabinet for the Jones administration, as well as, working in Ameren. So, we have opportunities now with access to resources that maybe didn't exist just a few years ago that could help us build these kind of community-based improvements. The American Rescue Plan, I mean, wow, $500 million coming to the City of St. Louis, not that much, but a substantial amount of money coming to the county. It is, I think, a really ripe time to rethink how our community can grow resilience at every level through the bonding, the bridging, and the linking, and taking advantage of these funds, many of which are already been identified to address things like school and school improvements, particularly targeting underserved communities. So to me, this is a really exciting time. This is meant to be a phoenix, because I think COVID has almost brought us rare opportunity to rethink how we work together, who we are close to, how to break down those barriers that have existed for so long within our own, identity communities, as well as within our borders, and come up with a solution that is going to create that power of community to build resilience. So thank you all. Happy to turn off my slideshow, and then we can see where we go.
I want to encourage everybody to turn on your video, and if you have a question, you can either put that in the chat, but I also want to encourage you to just speak it out and let's have a conversation. And I saw a question, I believe from Rebecca Weaver, unless that was just a clapping for the amazing presentation from Marianne Lazarus. And I just want to reiterate that I really appreciated that that presentation and the way that you not only talked about the built environment and your own specialty, but really integrated it with the social aspects of resilience in a beautiful way, and had dual emphasis. So I really appreciated that. Thank you again.
Thank you, Jen. Jess?
Any questions for Marianne?
Throw them at me. Come on. I thought I saw one. Jen is saying something. Let's see. I think it. Yeah. Okay.
And I do want to say that we are currently streaming to Facebook Live, and you're being recorded. So I just needed to make sure that everyone was aware of that.
So I'm going to mention what Jen just noticed, made a note that social capital is also indicator of voter turnout and civic engagement. So if you look at voter turnout, it also looks like that same map that we're so used to seeing, in which we weren't anymore. So that's another really good indicator of how strong a community is whether there's good voter turnout. And it's sort of almost circular. The greater the community, the greater the voter turnout, the greater the voter turnout. And so if we think about how to grow that capacity, that's another sort of way of building social capital.
Well, I have a question that kind of connects to your specialty on the built environment and resilience. So you talked about several kind of community center type spaces that are ways to boost a community's resilience, like libraries, cafes, these resilience hubs that you mentioned.
Yeah.
What about at a neighborhood level, like maybe thinking about building our homes so that we increase resilience and connection with our neighbors. Is that a conversation that happens a lot within the field of resiliency in architecture, or is it more focused on these hubs and these central community?
Well, I think the hub concept can apply at all scales. So it's not necessarily, you know, a major building like we described. Hubs can happen, you know, in terms of providing resilience resources. It can be, you know, even those little libraries outside people's houses, you know, or our community building, right? You get to know people. Oh, I lent you a book. Oh, that was interesting. You know, it's just chance for a conversation. In terms of the built environment, I very much like and certainly have seen the concept of creating places for people to have chance encounters, you know, just outside, you know, instead of everything being closed off, you know, I know my husband just built a bench in front of our house, and we can sit in our front, not up on the porch, but down at the, not street level, in between, and just see people walk by. So we're the old couple on the block waving at people, but you know, it's just a way to connect with people. Just how do you actually create an opportunity for that? Dog parks is another, you know, thing like that. But I think the physical manifestation of that, you know, creating more indoor outdoor spaces, which also has the added benefit of dealing with heat conditions, you know, when you have shading. I mean, there's all those kinds of multiple benefits when you create those kind of quasi-public, quasi-private spaces that absolutely help foster community.
I think stoop culture is really important, and I think it's often kind of denigrated by like urban planners and the people at the top.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know,
important benefits.
That no question about it, and having, you know, there's all kinds of urban design solutions that do that, like the length of blocks. You know, how long a walk do you have to get from one street to another? If those are shorter, you have more chance for encounters. People don't encounter each other. If you have stoops, you have front yards, you have front porches. So much of our world has been sort of wrecked by air conditioning, because people, you know, during the blackouts in New York, when that was the last one, you know, people went outside and they shared, you know, beer, and they hung out together and had pizza. They didn't even know each other, but now they couldn't be inside because it was too hot. So I mean, there's something about getting rid of air conditioning, or providing more climate-friendly spaces outside that would overcome that.
I think about the ability to see the entrances as well, and people going inside and out of their house, as opposed to people just kind of driving into the back and then going in and never being on the sidewalk and passing each other, and
right.
And seeing it is those chance encounters that you're saying.
Yeah, really important.
I want to see if there are other questions.
Jen's put a lot of really good resources in our chat. Thank you, Jen.
Yeah, Marianne, I really appreciated how, you know, you brought in that Jeffrey Bonner quote, and people not understanding, you know, the connection between their own health and the health of the planet, and all of these maps. I was in something the other day, and I just remembered that I grew up in a very, you know, all white neighborhood, segregated. All the houses were white, and there was parts of my city that I never went to. And so they were kind of disposable in my mind. And this whole idea of a disposable city, and that disconnect of bonding across communities. Like, you know, the neighborhood was great. We were running around. I knew my neighbors back then when I was a kid. And now it just seems like that's been really hard to address and to create those bonding type, you know, safety and trust relationships.
Yeah, I agree, Bob. And that's why I think with the kind of constant reminder now of how entrenched we have this structural racism is in our city, and the kind of inequities, that in thinking about how to, you know, build greater resilience, we need to think about how to break those kind of assumptions, those inherent biases. It's sort of a challenge, but that's why I feel like with our current condition of kind of resurgence, that we need to be very intentional about overcoming those, rather than saying, oh, well, we can go back and have our happy picnics in the park with all the people we used to know and love. It's like, who else do I want to be part of my life? How can we grow and find, common bonds?
Mm-hmm. Being more intentional about that as opposed to just working from our existing networks. It's incredible.
Exactly. Emily has something to say. You want to say it, Emily, rather than write it? No?
Can read it.
Emily says, Emily Andrews from USGBC, SLACO has a neat program that links North Side and South Side neighborhood leaders and residents just to get to know one another and overcome biases. So yeah, I've heard about that. It's been ongoing.
Absolutely. So. Well, we are in the last few minutes before we're going to switch over to our Consuming Kinetics dance company performance of Human Disturbance. And I just really want to thank Marianne so much for her talk. It's been amazing. And I also wanted to mention, we have several folks here who bought raffle tickets, and we just drew the raffle directly before this this talk. And so I just wanted to let folks know the winners. So the top three, the draws were for the Elsa House, it was Paul Todd Merrill. And for the cabin at Possum Hollow, it was Katie Mike Smestra Lamp. And then for the Union Station package, it was Tara Morton. So congratulations to all of you. And now I believe we're going to move into our dance company. I did want to mention that we have one more opportunity to get involved with Earth Week before it ends, and that is a volunteer cleanup in Dutchtown with the CID there. We're meeting at the Thomas Dunn Center in Marquette Park at 9:30 tomorrow morning and on Saturday, the 24th. So if you'd like to come out and pick up trash, it's going to be wet, but we are still moving ahead. And we've had some really amazing volunteer partnerships over the last couple of weeks, and some of them have been wet, and we've gone forward and they've been great anyway. So I do encourage you to still come on out. Absolutely, Emily, wet trash still needs to be picked up. Okay, so we are going to move on over to our CKDC dance company, and I believe Bob is going to introduce them. Is that correct?
Well, yeah,
again, Marianne.
Marianne Lazarus.
Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. I got to run.
Okay, bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Katrin Allen with the CK Dance Company. How you doing? So glad that you all could be here. Did everyone get out of school okay?
Yes, they did. All of our junior company is off stage over here. You'll see them in the next couple of pieces.
Right. Is that Katrin right there, or is that Erica?
It's Erica.
It's Erica. It sounds, oh, there you go. Surprise. I love it. So
I'm using
Erica Brown.
Yeah, I'm using Katrin's computer. So do you mind if we do a quick sound check?
Yeah, let's go ahead. We'll see if we can't pin your video up on the screen. I think we're trying to figure that out. But
come inside my heart a little while. Come closer with the song. The dance is a cold, it's halfway towards given.
Can we hear that pretty well?
that sounds really good to me. That sounds great.
Awesome. So the opening piece starts with just the sounds of waves. So it's possible that it might cut in and out in the beginning since it's just sort of some nature sounds in the background. But yeah, did you want me to say anything else before we get started?
Just say a little bit about the company.
Sure, I'd love to. So yeah, my name is Erica, and I'm the founder, artistic, and executive director. of CKDC, or Consuming Kinetics Dance Company, and we are a 501c3 nonprofit professional dance company and community education center. So our mission is to make dance accessible and expose the healing art of movement in our communities, and we do that through a variety of ways, and performance is obviously one of them. So we're really proud to be returning to an Earth Day celebration to perform, most especially this year because our spring concert is centered around ideas of conservation and how we can protect our planet. And so everything in this concert was very intentionally built with that concept in mind. So at the end, we're going to stick around. All the dancers are going to come into a semicircle, and we're here to tell you a little bit more about the 4 previews that you're going to see. These are very short excerpts of a larger body of work that we'll do next spring. And yeah, you can ask any questions about the content and what it might have been about, the choreographers, or even the dancers and their process and their experience. So we're really excited. And yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, take it away. Wonderful.
Why are we concerned with exposure to energy disruptors and effects on health? We know that there.
Come inside my heart a little while. Come closer with all your song. Your dance is a code, it's a pathway towards truth, and I am learning how to listen. Come inside my heart a little while. From you comes the honey of my song. Tempted tendrils, blooming color, tasting longing for you. Kissing hands of my reach. Our minds spend the spark that hearts can carry your hearts. But your flight weaves the remembrance of our stand. So we give our voices, so we give our voices to the ones that left us. So we give our voices to the ones who fight in silence. So we give our voices, so we give our voices to the ones whose speech is blown us so unique. So we give our voices, so we give our voices to the ones that left us. So we give our voices to the ones who cry in silence. So we give our voices, so we give our voices to the ones whose speech is loud so unique. Silence your heartbeat, long beat, hum. Inside my heart a little while. I woke up on the ground, now I let my sound. Threw my voice into the dark, but the dark had no mind, just repeated what I said. Claustrophobic at first, struck by hunger and thirst. I stood up and looked around, there was nothing to be found, just the one that I couldn't see. And I can't see how far underground. Then my fear begins. From far away, whisper the breeze. Telling me to move along next to take off. So I cornered was all. Took a breath and took a step. Encountering that long night. What a strange thing to find. In the next place in life, running like what's down the hall. And then I jumped in the dark. I was
there's only time to
Erica, thank you so much, everybody. That was wonderful performance.
Thank you.
Yeah, took me through a whole host of emotions there, you know, riding through. It's like so hard to keep track of everything. It's like there's like some hope, despair, disconnection. Then there's like people are together again. There's like circles. There's like this flowing movement of peace and harmony, and things get, oh my God, I can't. Please talk to me. You know, help me process what just happened to me.
Yeah, so you're right. It was a large range of happenings and emotions. So the first piece that you saw where we start out with the waves, it's just kind of a piece to talk about pollution in our oceans. But the piece is really covering like 3 different kinds of pollution. So in the second movement, you might have seen the duets. And so one person was standing in for those who might be harmed by industry and certain practices that are not sustainable. And then the person who was controlling was the person, you know, that maybe was in charge of those things. And we always use the image of like meat production. I'm like, are you guys a meat or are you a controller? Who's a meat? Who's a controller? So that's kind of like our abbreviated version, like how we talk about that. And then the third movement, which you didn't see, is about the type of toxins that can be in the products that we use and put on our body, and things like that. And then the second piece was Ashriel's, and she's not with us right now, but her piece is about climate change, right, Cass? And then the third piece that you saw that started with our student dancers on the ground, that's sort of like, I think the working title is Possible Outcomes, and that's a piece I've been working on that shows, you know, 5 close friends that wake up from this sort of devastation, you know, something happened to our world, and then when the professional company artists come on and they escort them off stage, they're sort of offering a more utopian version of their, you know, adulthood if we can only change our trajectory and the way that we care for the environment.
Yeah, that whole sense of despair, right, is really embodied in that moment, right?
Yeah, for sure. A lot of theatrics in that one. And then the last piece is our associate director, Katz, and it's a love story between plants and pollinators. And I think someone here has a big description of that piece, something to say about it. Is there someone from Katz?
Quinn or Jasmine had on there.
Yeah, Quinn or Jasmine, do you have that on you?
I do not have it on me, but I do have some parts memorized.
Okay, well, Quinn's gonna say a little bit more about that closing piece then.
So the title is The Beckoning, and it's about the story between plants and pollinators. The pollinators start, and we learned about many different pollinators throughout this process, like the no-see-ums, or otherwise known as midges, and they're the only pollinator that can get inside the cocoa bean that allows for us to have chocolate, even though they're a nuisance. Mean bugs still have a purpose in the cycle, and they have many different ways to pollinate.
Those midgets really had long arms. You know? I loved it.
Yeah.
But you're right, like so many different pollinators, you know, really have such a critical role to play, from like solitary bees to these little tiny midges. Yeah, it's very important to hummingbirds and other animals that help pollinate plants that help us get the food that we eat.
Yeah, definitely. And so, and these are just 4 works that'll be a part of a larger body of work, probably 8 pieces next spring when we return to the theaters, hopefully, or even return to the Earth Day Festival. So we're really looking forward to continuing to tell these really important stories, and we're open to any questions that people might have.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if I'll take a look at the chat, see if anybody's got anything in there, but I think people are probably still just like processing their emotions on watching the wonderful performance today.
Nice.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for having us.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us here at Earth Day 365. And we got some hand claps coming up from people. Yep.
It was a wonderful end to our Earth Week. Thank you so much for CD at CK Dance Company. That was amazing.
Thank you so much for having us.
Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all of our attendees that have stayed with us and keep coming up and stepping up into our community to make it better.
Yeah. Here's to live festival in Forest Park in 2022. Absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.